I think he's a great guy. I know in the last episode, I definitely went over a lot of the past and how tough it was, but a lot of that was he was drinking a lot, and he had a lot of issues with drinking and just other issues where there was someone in the local community who was just poisoning his brain. One of his BFFs who was just an envious asshole who honestly ended up going to jail anyways for Medicare fraud, but who cares about that asshole. But I want you to know that even though things were difficult and we had a really tough life, between the bond that we had, there was a lot of times where the guy showed up, he was there, and he was 100 times better than his worst of his parents, which was his mom. And he changed and he evolved, but a part of that was when he had to face his death. And I want you to know, I think my dad really is a nice guy, but ultimately because of his life and because of all the issues that have happened, he never got a chance to heal, or he never wanted to heal. He was okay in living in Delulu. And I guess for you all, that's really what I'm really trying to show is even though we can embrace our past and understand our past, realistically, it shows our shadow, but what that is, it really shows us some of our strengths. And I'm going to go into a lot of that right now. And I'm going to talk about some really cool stuff because for me, because of what happened back then, my ability to meditate, my ability to really understand the psyche and get into my feelings, my emotions and hearing, and just that mindfulness that I've been able to cultivate over the decades, but that really came from that. The ability that I'm one of the best financial analysts or business analysts and business strategists came from my trauma history. It was the vigilance of having to pick up patterns and seeing certain things, but it also came from just various abilities of pattern recognition and just realizing that hypervigilance that I was in, I was able to use all of that. And then in my times of self-reflection, or for some people they take self-reflection to disassociation and they take it to a whole nother extreme, but for me, I liked who I was. I had a tough time dealing with a lot of the pain, and I hated that part of me. So even though a lot of myself knew of my potential, loved who I was and where I was going, there was another part of me, my shadow, that just hated the other side. So that's where the anger lived. That's where the fear lived. And over time, I had to coexist with a lot of that. And there was periods of my life where that hypervigilance and the anxiety and the fear controlled my life, opposed to the other part of me, which is whole, powerful. I am my capacity to learn and my capacity to the speed of capacity is definitely an outlier. I'm a very flexible person and open-minded, and that's also very 3 standard deviations, just very much of an outlier. But a lot of that also came from maybe who I was, and also how I was able to take the pain in which I lived with and turn it into my power. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those ways that we, on the other side, and myself, once we've gone through so much difficulties and a tough life, how do we, use some of these ways of coping, and how we've really kind of used it as a way of success and a way of living a better life. But, one thing I had to really realize is I was relying on those coping mechanisms almost too much. I was allowing the hypervigilance and the anxiety and the racing thoughts as an ability to see patterns and just create. And it was part of my creativity. It was a part of my genius. And over time, what happened was that negative that was allowing me to survive, I was then using it to kind of thrive. And so I was putting myself in difficult situations and tough situations that would allow me to recreate those emotions, to then use those fear tactics and some of those other abilities that would help me, live and create. And that was another vicious cycle where I was like, hey, I can create this good and this level of quality without having to procrastinate to the last second, without using that adrenaline rush as my need to create. And I had to really learn how to use other outside and inside ways of tricking my body to actually perform. And instead of feeling like I had to just do things based on how my emotions felt, I was able to take a little bit more control of my life. And that's really kind of what we're going to talk about in this second part of it. Clearly abuse and difficult things in our childhood can happen. Another thing I said was we as humans, as we realize and we increase our level of consciousness, the ability to process mentally, the ability to understand, the ability to be present, that happens from not responding. I'm not reacting, but responding to life. That's being able to take a breath when difficult things happen and we feel activated or triggered. It's learning how to use that extra capacity to be more intentional with our next step. And so it's using that extra capacity to either understand, either to create, either to create value for yourself. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about in part 2. Clearly breaking that generational trauma. Things have happened. We're holding it in, and we need to realize that now as we look at our shadow, we look at some of our bad behaviors that came from that. How can we continue to build and keep those skills as we process and let go of that trauma? Because we got to let go of the past and the pain and the fear, but we still have to use that gifts and the abilities that saved us when things were really difficult. And that's really what we're going to be talking about in this part 2. So thank you so much. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Please share this with your friends. This is content for you to help you know that your pain is not uncommon, that we all share it, our own pain in our own ways, but how we internalize it, how we perceive it is our own. And I want you to know that you can live a better life. I believe in you, I believe in humanity, and I believe that together we can heal, grow, and maybe be the spark for someone else, and that good deeds are going to continue to bless us over life. So over time, heal, do good, and then enjoy the gifts from the universe as you can learn how to give, receive, and match the energy with it as you manifest and create your life. That was a lot of information, but hey, we have a lot more great content. Thanks so much. All right, everyone. So let's continue a little bit more of my story. Origins part 2. Realistically, let's talk a little bit more about the breaking the generational cycle, and let's talk about a little bit what happened. As I mentioned in one of my first episodes, I had a situation with a female nanny. Worked through a lot of that in a different way. I lost a testy, but that's a whole separate thing. But what we're talking about is those two traumas, I was able to manifest and work on it in a different way, where that was more relationship bound. But this is more fear and mindset. And now the trauma with my dad, when I explained, I received the worst beating because I wanted to start a business and I told my friend, it ruined his perception and his aura of him. And then for a couple of years, he was drinking, his mind was being poisoned by, someone in the community. And even though it's like, people would judge and be like, hey, why would that happen? Unfortunately, there are friends and there are people in our lives that sometimes are envious and don't always give the proper advice. So long story short, he was in a really bad spot. I think at this point he was pretty close to fearing for his life. He was already having a lot of health issues and he knew he was on one path. This is right before his bypass. And ultimately what happened was he was just getting too loud, and I had to, he was threatening, he pulled a knife, and he was just trying to control, and I just had to step up and be like, no, like, that's not gonna happen, and just threatening him, saying that if you do this, I'm gonna stop this forever. It broke the cycle for him. But for me, it started a whole new cycle where, in my mind, I was always a driven person, but I was always nervous of my power and who I was. And I think from that point, a part of me realized that, hey, for 14 years of my life, or maybe 10 years of memory, from 4 to 14, I had a lot of just bad memories of my dad, and I wouldn't even accept the good from him. But I was able to stop that cycle from then and there. Though I had to take over from doing the house chores and everything else, and even though he was around, he just did less, but just I had to do it, so I didn't have to deal with any of the other control or things. And at that point, I was like the man of the house. No one told me what to do. That's a whole nother can of worms. But ultimately for me, I was able to embrace who I was, and I saw then and there that life can completely change. That one action, one moment can ultimately change the rest of our life. And from that point, things just did get much better. And the stress and everything started kind of getting better, but ultimately I just took on more and more pressure, thinking I had to do it, and that led to me embracing a lot of the fear tactic, the hypervigilance, and a lot of those other beliefs and feelings I had that ended up just kind of trapping me. And ultimately, when I did therapy, probably in my mid-20s, because I was having a lot of like anger and emotional outbursts with an ex-girlfriend, and a lot of it stemmed from, when I was talking about it, I realized that part of it was I just felt like I'd never had a sense of control. I was always on this path that I always had to keep doing, and a lot of that stemmed from that moment where my dad just kind of gave up, and I was like a hyper-driven person. I was just meant to work. I was meant to do things and succeed, and just there was a goal. I was just the type of person who I wanted to achieve, and it was just, and I didn't matter what was going to happen. I knew I was going to do it. Almost like Naruto from the anime series. He was able to change people's hearts because he never gave up. His conviction and his attitude, I really had that inside of me. And I guess for you all, that's why I'm really creating a lot of this content, is because I think no matter what happens in life, once we survive, we realize that we can survive. No matter what happens, we can continue to survive. We can continue to grow. We can continue to go on a healthy and survivor type mentality, but we have to just make sure that we're not burning out, we're resting and taking care of ourselves. So a lot of the first episode was to show the difficulties and the pain that we can go through. And now it's really kind of realizing that when that's happened, how does our body just naturally survive in those type of environments and continue to grow and continue to live your life without these survival tactics going away as we heal. Then also, how can we continue to use those without burning out and actually healing? Because I had a tough time where I didn't want to heal, but I wanted the power to continue. But I also didn't want to fully let the power go, and I self-sabotaged my healing. So, I was really conflicted. So anyways, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, how do we internalize some of those, and how do we kind of see our shadow, see some of those pain. And so I'm going to go into just a couple different examples that will maybe show you how you're stuck and how you've kind of stayed in that abuse, or what you felt at life and never quite were able to let go. Some of these signs or behaviors might be a symbol of where you're kind of holding it in and what you need to do to kind of let go. So let's go right into it. Hey everyone, so let's talk a little bit more. Now, as I mentioned, when negative things happen, for me, I realized when I was doing a trauma book and I learned about the ACE score, and I realized that what happened to me was really complex PTSD. It was a prolonged period of traumatic events and stressors, and ultimately, even though sometimes little stress over time can actually do more damage than one traumatic event, complex PTSD is a very deep-rooted and a difficult situation. For me, as I've probably explained, there's 4 traumatic events I've already explained in this, besides, some relationship stuff that happened a little bit later in life. To me, that's like my 5th long prolonged issue that I've really enjoyed kind of letting go, that one at this phase, which I'm not even gonna get into my relationship stuff for probably many years, just because for me, I think I'm still on a journey to find, love, like I want to find my forever partner. And even though I say that I'm on this path of, right now exploring polyamory or ethically non-monogamy, I know at some point I will have a long-term healthy monogamous type relationship. But for me, this is a phase of me figuring out who I am. And that's because I was stuck in bonds and situations that were really designed for the partner's needs and validating my need for being needed, opposed to mutual reciprocal love. But now that's a whole nother can of worms that I already opened, but I'm not going to get into really further. So for me, I want you all to realize is when you've had trauma, you've had difficulties at a such early age, what happens, and what I learned from the ACE score is I was a 7 out of 10 ACE score. So the likelihood that I was going to die of a health-related issue, I had a shortened life, and that I was dealt to have addiction and other poor maladaptive behaviors was just so high. And I realized that I didn't want to live a cursed life. I didn't want to have all these Horcruxes within me, as a Harry Potter reference, So I had to realize, how did I uncover each one, heal what I need to heal, pull out the pain or the poison or the old, and then learn how to grow around the scar. And I think for me, I had to see patterns and I had to understand kind of what was going on. So let me kind of give 8 different situations that I think would be really helpful for you all to really understand how people kind of keep in some of that pain. Number 1, hypervigilance. Constantly being on high alert, feeling easily startled, jumpy in response to potential threats or triggers. For example, always scanning the environment for potential danger or being overly sensitive to sudden movements or loud noises. Do any of you feel some of that? That's hypervigilance. So that's something you may want to talk to a therapist or a professional about what you might be feeling, and they might be able to help you uncover the why. Maybe my content might spark some of that, but always use a professional to help process some of these feelings. Analyzing too quickly, using a fast-paced cognitive processing and quickly assessing, analyzing situations. This can be a coping mechanism from needing to anticipate to respond to situations at home. For instance, rapidly assessing people's body language or tone or voice to anticipate potential dangers or hostility. Now for me, over time, even though I knew I was safe, I still kept ruminating and using these quick anxiety type racing thoughts to see various things going on, to see things at work. And that's part of the way that I became super successful, is because of these racing almost type thoughts. And then what would happen is, the third behavior that I've seen is pattern recognition. That's developing a hyper sense of identifying patterns, particularly relating to conflict or abusive behaviors. This can involve being able to recognize subtle cues or indications of potential harm, being able to almost anticipate and impede arguments by recognizing behavioral patterns or triggers. So this is someone who just really understands people. They're able to see patterns and see how people behave. I was always more of a mathematician and numbers person. So for me, I learned patterns and seeing that in a mathematical sense at a very young age. So for me, as my trauma and those other situations happened, I was able to kind of see patterns, and I would always be quick to assume and judge someone based on some of these patterns. So another one that I think most people do, I've seen a lot of my friends, a lot of my co-workers and other ones, and even though they've never had trauma or they've never expressed it, they use a lot of this emotional numbing with using TV and other vices to escape. So let's just talk about what emotional numbing is. It's experiences of disconnecting from one's own emotions as a defense mechanism to protect against overwhelming fears. It can result in emotionally being detached, having difficulty expressing emotions. For example, feeling numb or detached can occur during inner turmoil and processing, traumatic memories, and so emotionally numbing helps it from resurfacing. So I've had probably the least connection with this one because I'm one who I like to feel the pain, I like to feel the fear, and emotionally numbing to me was not something I really connected with. But I think for you all, if you have difficulties running or processing or embracing your emotions, this is where you might really want to do some cognitive behavioral therapy or maybe some EMT type experiences where you can use these various methods, and you can actually process the feelings with professionals, and they can spark the emotion so you can actually feel it in a safe way, and you can get in the pattern of feeling it. Because most people, I feel like, who are in that type of emotional numbing usually also use avoidance. They try to avoid the situation, people, places, or things that might trigger those memories or reminders of the past abuse. Again, I was the opposite. I like to relive a lot of that, to feel it, to understand it, to kind of break the cycle, and almost keep myself in the cycle. But a lot of people who use avoidance, what they're going to do is they're going to intentionally steer clear of specific environments, people associated to past traumatic events, and locations, and even certain abusive relationships. Like I've seen a lot of situations where there's been, men or women who were molested by someone at a very young age, and over time, what happens is when they've gotten older, they've either avoided that gender or they have embraced more of that gender because that's what they knew. Kind of like, I won't get into examples, but those are some of the avoidance theories that I've seen in people with sexual dysfunction that have happened at a young age. Though that's not what happened to me. Those were, I guess, the more common scenarios that I saw that I think to me might help make a case. Like I had a friend who, in my gut, I genuinely never seen her happier in a lesbian relationship, but the person she picked for her first relationship was, which we didn't know, was a drug addict and was just a broken emotional person, and ruined her first experiences. So now she hasn't dated a man and she hasn't dated a woman, and she says, I'll never date a woman again. But in my heart of hearts, it felt like that's where she was the happiest before the abuse came on. So now she's avoiding that altogether. And for most of her life, she kind of emotionally numbed those other feelings. So, another thing is usually when people have difficulties, and this is kind of more towards the later stage, first it happens, then I've really kind of also portrayed this in the level of intensity, but then it goes into self-isolation, where you're withdrawing from social interactions, relationships, in a way of protecting oneself from potential harm or traumatization, where those people are going to bring that up and people can't deal with it, where they're going to invoke different behaviors of trying to socially isolate themselves, keeping distance from other people and preventing any vulnerability. And this is when people kind of just shut down and they don't quite open up. Once the vulnerability and being able to be vulnerable is closed, it's hard to reopen. So that's when they'll just start avoiding social gatherings, distancing themselves from one another, and just limiting the exposure for any potential conflicts or abuse. This is kind of what I mentioned with my friend who took his life a couple weeks ago. He at this point just self-isolated, lost his dog, broke up with his girlfriend, none of his friends knew, and he ended up just taking his life. And so that's why I always tell people, one, talk to your friends, go see a professional. But two, if you're not hearing from people and the communication shut down, sometimes check in more. And even if you think of someone, shoot them a message. You never know the impact that you can have on someone. The next step is hypervigilance and people pleasing. This is really where I know probably my own past experience, because I hated fawning over people, but I ended up always finding these people I always put on a pedestal, and then I a strong desire to appease them and constantly seek approval, validation from these people in order to prevent future conflict or abuse, and also as a source of almost addiction or people pleasing, and just like their validation is what kept me going. Like, I had a friend from high school, I put her over every relationship. I thought she was like a BFF, and I thought I was gonna marry her, but ultimately she always ignored me. I was just a quick validation for what she needed. I was a good friend when she needed it, but ultimately she lived her own life. I was the project, it really what felt like, and ultimately I put all my love and my hope and belief that once she would see me for my value, then everything would change. But ultimately, that type of belief was horrible, and I'm so glad I broke that over time. But it was a long process for me. And I think the hypervigilant people pleasing, it may really involve constantly prioritizing other people's needs over our own, suppressing our personal preferences and boundaries, constantly monitoring or adaptive our behavior to meet the expectations of the others, and even at the expense of ourselves. It's almost like always checking in, what's wrong, what do you need, over just asking ourselves that. It's like paying so much attention to those people because that's what we need to do. And as I mentioned earlier, in the analyzing quickly or the pattern recognition or the hypervigilance, what I'm talking about now is once you get to people pleasing, it's almost kind of at the later stage of the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. We're talking almost fawn at this pace. And then when it's still not happening, this is when people just start really just shutting down. That's when the disassociation happens, when they start disconnecting from their own body, their emotions, and the surroundings as a way of escaping and the overwhelming distress. So the self-isolation was like was a step before this. This is kind of shutting down all parts of their being because they just can't deal with it. And this can manifest in detachment from reality, spacing out, having gaps in memories during times of turmoil, feeling disconnected, and observing oneself from almost a heightened sense of stress and turmoil, and almost distancing self. It's almost like the out-of-body experience. And so, what I really want to talk about is how important it is, because when we realize that we're going through some of these feelings, we can finally work through it and see the pattern. But I think for me, I hated to disassociate. When I got to the point where I was numbing and pulling away, that's when I knew something was wrong. That's when my panic attack started. It's like, no, bro, like, we're gonna freak out. I'm gonna throw up. I'm gonna vagus nerve hit. And I was back to myself. But I had to realize the pattern I was in. And I think for you all, I really hope that these examples was an aha moment for you, because it was for me. So let's talk a little bit more, and let's talk about how we can start really kind of processing it once we realize. Hey everyone, so I know this is just a lot of information, and if you feel overwhelmed or shut down, or if some of these feelings me talking about it brought up something from the past. It's really good for you to, go speak it out, talk to your friends, talk to your family, bring in your village, start processing it, go see some professionals. If you need medication, go see that. I think it's important because, know that this is so common within humanity, and, learning for me on this journey, kind of learning about the fight or flight process, the cognitive triangle, the parasympathetic nervous system, just learning how just automatic this is, and then learning how my reactions and things around the world, like, all the literature and all the books I've read, it's just so common. But for us, when we're in this pain, it just feels so intense. It feels so tough. And I hope that this content has really shown you that life is not always fair, but ultimately, if we're able to see the cycles and the patterns, that we do have a sense of control in our own life. It's how we respond and react, and learning how to take some intentional actions, taking some accountability, and learning how to see our own power. Because knowing that we can react and respond is knowing that we still have some power and influence over the situations around us, because we do. The moment that we give up and we just say the world will provide without telling the world what you need or what you want or what you desire, it's just saying, the world will take care of me, and you just do nothing. How's the world going to know how to take care of you if you don't ask for it? I wish I will have health in my lungs. I wish I will have health in my mind. I wish I will have friends in my life. I wish I will have enough abundance and money to pass on for many generations of people in the globe, even once I'm gone. You have to be intentional with what you want. You can't just say some half-assed thing that isn't fully formed. So I think part of realizing that you're meant for more is kind of figuring out your purpose. So first, realizing that maybe our purpose and our desire and our inner voice is locked. Okay, why is it locked? And we talked about a lot of that. It could be something from our past. It could be something from our right now. And there's a lot of content that I have that will talk about mindset, our past, figuring out the why, figuring out how to start, what's going to keep going once we start. This is really kind of figuring out, breaking that cycle, so that way we can create a mindset and never give up and really find our purpose. So what is your purpose? What is the times in your life where you're so calm and your heart is able to sing free? And that's really what I'm hoping you'll be able to work through and find on your own journey. So I want you to know that even though life has never been the most predictable thing, the more I've embraced letting go and embracing and not forcing life and just accepting things and just nudging things as they come along, it's given me a lot more faith and belief. And I hope you can see that you can truly change your stars, and you can change the life in which you can have for the future. Like my dad, no matter what, things got tough, but in his heart, he was a good guy. He may have had a broken spirit and a broken mind and, at times a broken body. His heart was always in the good place when his emotions and everything else didn't run amok. And he was able to change in his own way. He'll never be the perfect dad. He'll never be what I need. But ultimately, I learned the right lessons, and I can be exactly more than what I have, and give my daughter the blessings of life. And even though she's just going to have to break her own cycles and break her own things that she's picked up on the way, her journey will be a little bit easier. And I hope for you, your life will be a little bit easier. So, Ayubowan, may you be blessed with a long life, and may that long life be free of pain, where you can embrace the suffering. You can work towards creating happiness and freedom of suffering and bliss. and you can find your own awakening and enlightenment of your mind, and find many places and many situations where you can find that nirvana or that happy place. Like in Billy Madison, he got to go in his happy place and he leveled up. I hope you can find that every day. Let it be your life. So with that, I'm Saul Matthew of Koos's Key. Please subscribe, please follow, please share. I really appreciate all of you. Thank you so much.